Tension in the Caribbean is rising faster than at any time in the last decade. Venezuela is no longer just preparing for conflict. It is openly warning of a massive deployment of its forces in case the United States decides to take military action. And unlike other nations that might fold under pressure, Caracas is signaling something very different. It is ready. The latest spark came when China delivered one of its most advanced air surveillance systems, the JY-26 Skywatch-U 3D long-range radar, to Venezuela. This is not a symbolic shipment. It's a serious strategic asset with real implications for U.S. stealth operations. The JY-26 is known for one thing the Pentagon hates: its ability to detect stealth aircraft such as the F-35 for Venezuela, which for years struggled to counter U.S. airborne superiority. This radar changes the equation. Suddenly, American jets can no longer assume they have the element of surprise. And China didn't send just a radar. It sent a message that Beijing is stepping directly into what Washington has always called its backyard. Without saying it outright, China is implying if the U.S. stirs trouble in Asia, China can stir trouble in the Caribbean. Alongside the radar, China has been deepening defense ties with Venezuela for years. Satellites, communications, coastal surveillance systems, and even anti-ship missile cooperation. Bit by bit, Caracas is no longer standing alone. Meanwhile, Russia has been equally active. Moscow regularly rotates strategic bombers through Venezuela, supplies maintenance for Su-30 Mk-2 fighters, and cooperates on military training and intelligence sharing for Washington. The idea of both Russia and China operating so close to U.S. territory is unsettling. So why is Venezuela not afraid, despite Washington's harsh language, sanctions, and military pressure? The answer is simple. It knows it is no longer isolated. Caracas has two major powers standing behind it, and both have global interests that extend far beyond their own borders. At the same time, the United States has moved its own assets into the region. Over the last days, American naval forces, including large surface combatants and the USS Gerald R carrier strike group, have increased activity around the Caribbean basin and the North Atlantic approaches. The presence of a U.S. aircraft carrier near Venezuelan waters is not normal. It signals seriousness. Washington wants to remind Caracas, and indirectly Beijing and Moscow, that it still dominates the seas. But Venezuela's reaction has not been submission. Instead, it has responded with mobilization. From border deployments to air defense alerts and naval patrols, Caracas is preparing as though a showdown could happen at any time. This is not a country acting out of panic. This is a country acting out of calculation. Venezuela knows that if Washington attacks directly, it would not be a limited conflict. It would pull in geopolitical forces far larger than the U.S. expects. And if Venezuela uses the new Chinese radar alongside Russian-built Su-30 fighters and coastal missile batteries, U.S. planners would need to think twice. The Caribbean would no longer be a playground. It would become a contested zone. China's move also sends a signal to the rest of Latin America. For decades, many nations felt that their only security partner was Washington. But now, with China offering high-tech systems and long-term cooperation, countries see another path, one not based on sanctions or pressure. Russia, too, has intensified its diplomatic posture in the region. Moscow describes the Western Hemisphere as multipolar territory, meaning no single power should dominate. That concept directly challenges the century-old U.S. Monroe Doctrine. All of this explains why Venezuela today behaves differently than smaller nations that often crumble under U.S. pressure. Caracas knows it has alternatives: military, economic, and political. It also knows that any conflict in the Caribbean would draw global attention. Unlike isolated nations, Venezuela sits at the center of a strategic triangle: U.S. influence to the north, Russian military cooperation to the east, and Chinese technological support to the west. For the U.S., the situation is becoming uncomfortable. The threat of facing anti-ship missiles, early warning radars, and a Russian-supported air force complicates any idea of a quick or decisive strike. For Venezuela, this is a moment of leverage. The country can demonstrate to its neighbors that aligning only with one superpower is no longer the default path. Multipolarity is no longer theory. It's happening on their doorstep. But it also means the region is entering a dangerous period. Miscalculations, miscommunications, or a single armed incident could turn political tension into open conflict. And with global players involved, the fallout would not stay confined to the Caribbean. For now, Venezuela continues to prepare. The U.S. continues to move ships and assets. China and Russia continue to deepen their commitments. And the world watches as the Caribbean, once quiet, slowly transforms into the newest front of global power competition. And that new reality is beginning to ripple far beyond Venezuela's borders. Regional militaries are quietly reassessing their defense strategies, wondering whether the long-standing belief that the U.S. would always dominate the Caribbean is still valid. The presence of Chinese radar, Russian air defense systems, and a Venezuelan military gaining renewed confidence creates a strategic environment no one predicted a few years ago. Behind closed doors, U.S. intelligence agencies are increasingly concerned. Not because Venezuela suddenly became a global military power, but because the combination of external support, geography, and political resolve makes any potential U.S. action far riskier than before. The Pentagon understands that wars aren't won by firepower alone. They're shaped by perception, alliances, and the willingness of the opponent to absorb early blows and continue fighting. Meanwhile, China and Russia are carefully calibrating their involvement. Neither wants an open conflict with the United States, but both want to send a clear message. The era of uncontested American dominance in the hemisphere is over. Their involvement in Venezuela is deliberate, strategic, and designed to challenge Washington without crossing the threshold into a direct confrontation. For Venezuela, this moment is transforming its geopolitical identity. After years of sanctions and isolation, the country is now using its strategic location as leverage, a pivotal point where major power competition can shift. With every new shipment, every radar integration, and every military exercise, Caracas is reshaping how the world views the Caribbean. Even within the Venezuelan military, morale has shifted. Soldiers who once expected to be overwhelmed in the first hours of a U.S. attack now see layered defenses, international support, and modern systems being deployed at a fast-paced. Confidence matters in geopolitics. And right now, Venezuela's confidence is at its highest point in years. Diplomatically, Caracas is also gaining ground. Countries that once distanced themselves now recognize that Venezuela's resistance to pressure may set a precedent for a more independent regional posture. For nations weary of unilateral sanctions and political interference, this moment feels like a test of how much the global balance has changed. At sea, the situation grows more crowded. Venezuelan naval patrols are pushing farther out, shadowing foreign vessels and establishing a clearer maritime presence. While still no match for U.S. naval power, these patrols send a message. Venezuela intends to defend every inch of its waters, especially with anti-ship missile batteries now positioned along key coastal zones. In Washington, lawmakers are debating how to respond. Some demand a harder line, while others warn that escalating pressure could backfire by driving even more countries toward China and Russia. The U.S. faces a dilemma it hasn't faced in this region for generations: how to project power without triggering a geopolitical backlash it cannot control.